I wanted to dismiss it. I really did. Because the internet is full of screenshots and leaks and half-baked panic, people building a whole alternate reality out of a blurry PDF and a timestamp. And most of the time, that's exactly what it is: noise. But this one didn't behave like noise. A document appeared on a Senate legislative portal, sat there for minutes, and then vanished. Not hours. Not a day later after a reporter called for comment. Minutes. Long enough for someone to grab it, short enough to feel like a hand slapped it off the table the second it hit the light. And here's the part that keeps snagging in my head. Legitimate government bureaucracy is slow. Slow is the whole point. Slow is the safety feature. So when something official moves fast, when it pops up and disappears like someone realized they left a door unlocked, that doesn't prove a conspiracy, but it does prove urgency. I'm not asking you to believe a grand story. I'm asking you to notice a pattern. When institutions get scared, they don't announce it. They adjust, quietly, procedurally, in ways that look boring until you realize what they're preparing for. Within the next stretch of hours, 3 separate signals showed up. Each one, on its own, could have an innocent explanation. But stacked together, they start to look less like coincidence and more like the system switching into a kind of survival mode. First, the military side of the house. Reports of a high-level meeting focused on continuity protocols. Those dry, cold phrases that only surface when the government starts asking itself what happens if normal command relationships stop being reliable. I can't verify every detail of who sat where or what exact slide deck got shown, but I know what the phrase means. Continuity planning isn't a trend. It's a firewall. Second, the markets. When people tell you the bond market is nervous, that's usually a euphemism for money quietly running away from uncertainty. Treasury yields don't spike because someone is bored. They spike when traders smell risk they can't model. The chatter about internal memos and extreme scenario categories, again, I can't authenticate the exact label someone claims a bank used. But the behavior matters. If institutional money starts pricing political stability as a variable, that's not a social media mood. That's professionals paying for insurance. Third, the Senate, procedure, rules, language that normally only the most sleep-deprived staffers care about. Suddenly, it looked like leadership wanted to move fast, using internal mechanisms to accelerate debate, lock in timelines, and reduce the surface area where the executive branch can delay or dominate the narrative. Here's the thing I keep coming back to. You can fake a screenshot, sure. You can invent a rumor, yes. But you can't easily fake a synchronized shift across independent systems, military continuity posture, market behavior, and legislative procedure, unless something real is pushing them in the same direction. Now, the document itself. It wasn't a dramatic manifesto. It wasn't a confession. That's what makes it more unsettling. It read like law, like somebody preparing a legal frame in advance of an event. The title, dry, technical, something along the lines of limiting presidential authority under extraordinary conditions. It's the kind of heading that most people would scroll past. And then you get into the substance, and you realize the paper is doing something very specific. It's building a map. Section by section, it lines up the constitutional territory like a battlefield diagram, Article 1 versus Article 2, the old, ugly tug-of-war between legislative power and executive power, with that familiar Supreme Court landmark sitting in the background like a warning sign. The idea that emergency isn't a magic word that lets any president become whatever they want to become. If you've never read the legal history around executive power in crisis, here's the short version. Every generation gets tempted by the same fantasy, that the president can simply declare necessity and the rest of the system will salute. And every generation eventually relearns that the Constitution is not built to run on fantasy. It's built to resist it. The memo's first part basically says, don't pretend this is uncharted. The map already exists. And if a president tries to operate outside it, the other branches are not obligated to follow. Then the second part goes further, into the mechanics of containment. The idea that Congress can, through internal acts and votes, signal that an emergency declaration is not legitimate, not recognized, not granted the usual deference. This is the part where people on the internet start shouting words like nullify. And I want to be careful here because legal language is precise and outrage language isn't. But the intent is clear. They're preparing a legislative posture that says, in plain English, you don't get to do this alone. The third part is the one that doesn't read like theory. It reads like preparation. It raises the question of military command and the chain of lawful orders. It doesn't have to say mutiny to imply the real concern. What happens if an order comes down that senior officials believe is unlawful or unconstitutional or designed to bypass civilian constraints? How does the system respond without breaking itself apart? And if you think that sounds dramatic, ask yourself why lawyers inside the defense apparatus would circulate guidance on distinguishing lawful orders from unlawful ones. That is not something you do when everything is fine. That's what you do when you're trying to prevent a worst-case scenario from turning into irreversible damage. Then there's the final portion, the human tell. Resignations. When people with high-end legal roles resign in a cluster, you have to ask why. Sometimes it's political theater. Sometimes it's a career move. Sometimes it's exhaustion. But mass resignations, especially among people whose job is to provide legal cover, mean one of two things. Either they were asked to sign something they can't defend, or they believe what's coming cannot be defended. And if you've ever watched institutions under strain, you know the quiet rule. When the lawyers run, it's because the paperwork is turning radioactive. This is where I stopped trying to treat it as a weird internet artifact and started treating it like a warning flare. Because what followed wasn't just commentary, it was behavior. Reports began circulating that certain agencies were tightening how they handle sensitive intelligence, restricting access, reducing the flow of the highest level material into political channels. Again, I cannot independently verify every operational detail. These aren't things that come with press releases. But the logic is disturbingly consistent. In times of perceived instability, intelligence communities don't announce distrust. They express it through procedures, need-to-know walls, limited distribution, narrower briefings, fewer people in the loop. That's not deep state. That's risk management. And then the Senate. Here's the mistake people make when they watch government. They think the real drama happens in speeches. It doesn't. Speeches are for the public. The real drama happens in calendars, rules, and votes. If Senate leadership believes an extraordinary collision is coming, legal, political, institutional, then their priority becomes simple. Create a path that keeps authority inside the building, inside procedure, inside a framework that courts and history recognize as legitimate. Which is why the talk of a resolution, call it whatever number you want, matters less as a headline and more as a tool. A resolution like that, if designed correctly, isn't about passing a law in the classic sense. It's about establishing the Senate's official position and triggering a chain of consequences. Hearings, injunction requests, subpoenas, procedural barriers, public legitimacy, and, most importantly, the ability to say, we acted, we didn't watch, we didn't enable. And the reason that matters is because certain senators, especially the ones who survived the last decade of political earthquakes, understand something the internet doesn't. You can get away with a lot in politics, but you cannot always get away with legal liability. If leadership thinks an executive action could later be judged unconstitutional, they start asking a terrifying question. Who gets prosecuted afterward? That's why you start hearing references to statutes nobody casually quotes on television. It's why legal counsel starts speaking in terms of exposure, criminality, and personal consequence. Because when the stakes climb high enough, political loyalty competes with self-preservation. Now, I know how this sounds. I know the temptation is to swing to one extreme or the other, to say this is all fabricated and laugh it off, or to say it's proof of something apocalyptic and start stockpiling. I'm not doing either. I'm telling you what I see, the shape of a system bracing for impact. And if I'm wrong about the cause, I may still be right about the effect. When institutions believe legitimacy is at risk, they move to protect legitimacy, not by yelling, by tightening bolts. What are the possible outcomes? 1. De-escalation. The executive branch backs down, reframes, delays, retreats into conventional channels. It's the cleanest outcome and, frankly, the least cinematic. And because it's least cinematic, people underestimate it. But pride is a factor. So is the political reality that backing down can be interpreted as weakness. That makes this outcome possible, but not comfortable. 2. Legal warfare, not tanks, not sirens, lawyers, motions, temporary restraining orders, competing interpretations, orders issued, challenged, paused, reinstated, appealed. This is the scenario where the country doesn't collapse. It just gets dragged into a grinding institutional fight where every day feels like a cliffhanger. The government still functions, but trust erodes in real time, and the public learns, again, how fragile legitimacy becomes when everyone starts claiming the Constitution is on their side. 3. The nightmare branch. the scenario where someone tries to force reality to match their narrative by making a move that dares institutions to obey or resist. This is where you hear people whispering about extraordinary powers and emergency acts, not because those powers guarantee success, but because invoking them is a way to test loyalty. It's a stress test that can crack the system even if the attempt fails. And here's the part that gets ignored. The world watches. When a major democracy shows signs of internal instability, allies don't clap and cheer. They start contingency planning, quietly. They reassess intelligence sharing. They reroute diplomatic risk. They ask whether commitments are still reliable, not because they hate you, but because their job is to keep their own countries safe. Rivals do the same calculation from the opposite angle. Instability is opportunity. If you think geopolitical actors don't pay attention to the internal cohesion of the United States, you haven't been paying attention to them. So where does that leave us? If a Senate resolution does move, it becomes an institutional statement, a line drawn on paper that says, we do not recognize this as legitimate. Whether that line holds depends on courts, on public pressure, on internal discipline, on the willingness of officials to accept that legitimacy comes from law, not force. If courts get pulled in, we enter the slow, ugly process of adjudication, where people will claim victory no matter what happens, and the country will test whether it still respects outcomes it doesn't like. If the executive branch defies the system's final tools, impeachment, removal mechanisms, internal checks, stop being theoretical and start being real. And yes, there are constitutional processes involving incapacity, but those are blunt instruments with enormous political and social cost. Mentioning them is itself a signal that someone somewhere is thinking about outcomes they'd rather not say out loud. I don't need you to accept the most dramatic interpretation. I need you to recognize what it means when multiple pillars of the system start acting like they're preventing a fire rather than debating policy. A vanished document doesn't prove the building is burning, but people don't quietly pull the fire doors shut for fun. And if I'm wrong, then this will pass, and we'll all move on and pretend the tension wasn't there. But if I'm right, even partially, then what's coming won't look like a single moment. It'll look like a sequence of decisions, each one justified as necessary, until one day you look back and realize the country crossed a line without anyone ringing a bell. That's why you need to watch the next moves, not the next speeches. Watch the votes. Watch the court filings. Watch who resigns. Watch who suddenly stops showing up to defend something they used to defend without blinking. Because in a real institutional crisis, the loudest people are rarely the most important. The important people move quietly, and the evidence shows up as procedure. If you want to keep tracking this with me, stay close. Not because I'm promising you a secret truth, but because the truth, whatever it is, will reveal itself in the pattern of actions. And the pattern is already starting to write its own story.